All right, good morning, everyone. I'm excited to continue the conversation. It's been a great presentation so far. So my name's Meghan McElvy. I'm a partner in the Energy Litigation Group here in Houston at Baker Botts. It's an honor to be moderating this panel. With me to my left, immediately, Rich Byrnes is the Chief Infrastructure Officer for Port Houston. Helen Curie, who's the Chief Economist for ConocoPhillips. Then we have Mark Finley, who's a Fellow in Energy and Global Oil for the Baker Institute. And at the end, Meghan Nutting, who is the Executive Vice President of Government and Regulatory Affairs for Sonova Energy Corporation. So I guess if we could start I always think it's more interesting for you all to tell everyone here a little bit more about yourself than me reading a long bio. So if you could each take, 2 or 3 minutes tops and tell everybody a little bit more about your background and what you do.
Sure. Thank you very much. And thank you for having me here at this prestigious forum. I'm the infrastructure officer at the port, which means I'm not the economist. We'll talk about the economics and the macro trends that we just heard about. I'll try to keep my comments a little bit to, the on-the-ground realities of Houston and the energy sector and the petrochemical complex that is going to be driving a lot of things around this energy transition and so forth. Engineer by background, management and policy background as well, so I try to know a little bit about a lot and connect dots, which is really one of the major roles of the port as far as energy transition goes today. So thank you.
Helen?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Helen Curry, Chief Economist with ConocoPhillips. So I'll make a quick plug for ConocoPhillips. If you're not familiar with us, we are the world's largest independent E&P company. We have production of roughly 1.5 million barrels of oil equivalent per day, and we're active at around 14 countries around the world. We are a pure upstream company. As many of you know, we spun off our downstream a little over a decade ago. What my team does today is largely focus on anything from where oil and gas markets are in the here and now. So we provide a lot of guidance to our management team on where oil and gas markets are going in the near term. And then we wander out further on the time horizon to 30 years, and we have a series of global energy scenarios that we utilize in corporate planning at ConocoPhillips to help shape our longer-term strategy, or strategies, I should say, plural, to recognize what are the potential ups or downs or both for oil and gas, as well as other opportunities that we may have along the way in the energy space. So look forward to being part of the panel this morning. Thank you.
Mark?
Thanks, Meghan. Hi, everyone. I'm Mark Finley. I'm from Washington, D.C., and I'm here to help. That's usually a reaction I get outside of the Beltway. I'm a fellow here at the Center for Energy Studies, and it's the culmination of a career spent at the intersections of energy, economics, and national security. Before joining the Baker Institute 3 years ago, I was the senior economist in the U.S. for BP, and presented BP's annual work here at the Baker Institute, for many years. At BP, I manage the annual statistical review of world energy, so data collection, Joe, as well as both the short and long-term oil market analysis, and also had a role in the overall preparation of the BP long-term energy outlook. And so, while I have a focus on the energy, on oil, I have oil within the context of the whole energy picture and thinking both about the data, short-term issues, long-term issues, and how it connects with economic and broader business themes. And before that, I was an energy security and Middle East specialist at the CIA for 13 years. And so I've been thinking in various formats about the role of energy in our economic and strategic well-being as well for much of the last 40 years.
Excellent. Thanks. Meghan?
It's good to be here. Meghan Nutting, I'm the Executive Vice President of Government and Regulatory Affairs at Sonova. We are a solar company based here in Houston, believe it or not. We're a residential solar and storage service provider. We operate in about 40 markets across the U.S. That includes Guam, Saipan, Puerto Rico, so states and territories. My team and I work on regulatory and legislative policy in all of those 40 markets and at the federal level as well. I've been working on distributed solar policy for about 15 years now, about as long as it's really been around.
Thanks. So our panel, the topic of our panel is macro risk in the energy landscape, and I was chatting with some folks last night about, preparing for this and kind of joking, boy, there's just nothing to talk about on that subject. But I do want to start kind of on the economics point. So Helen, starting with you, if there is a recession, or if we're already in one, as many people I think would say, how would U.S. producers like ConocoPhillips and others react to that? And what would you expect to see?
So in terms of are we in a recession, if we sort of address that for a moment, clearly if you use our traditional definition of a recession being 2 consecutive quarters of GDP contraction, the U.S. has already been in a recession for half of this year. And we may be headed even for some more negative numbers in the next quarter. We shall see. But in terms of how U.S. producers or how U.S. production is likely to respond to that, there are a couple of ways to think about that. For many companies, we tend to take a longer-term planning horizon, so we're not necessarily changing the drill bit or changing our number of rigs running or frac crews just based on short-term dynamics. So the key thing that most producers are going to be looking at is what is the longer-term horizon, and is how do you come out of this recession? What is your point of view on commodity prices coming out of that? So it tends to be at least on the short side, I would say 1 to 3 year kind of time horizon for some operators, but for many others, and my company being one of them, we're looking at more like long-term, 5, 10, longer horizon type of points of view on prices, and that governs our capital allocation decisions.
Okay. Just following up on that, the point you made about commodity prices, I guess classically one might think that during a recession, prices would come down, but that certainly hasn't been what we've seen so far this year. Do you expect this to be an atypical recession in that regard for U.S. production or commodities prices?
It could be, insofar as oil especially is a globally traded and globally priced commodity and market. So a slowdown in the United States doesn't necessarily move the needle for the global oil market. It can, but not necessarily. Today's situation is different in the sense of there are obvious elements that are unusual occurring in the European market with Russia's supplies and how the whole world is responding to that in the upcoming sanctions. But it's certainly possible for us to go through the next 12 to 16 or 18 months with the U.S., let's say hypothetically, remaining in a recession, but commodity prices, oil, gas, probably coal as well, being at price levels that are higher than what many of us have become accustomed to.
Mark, just switching to you, I guess I would start out asking, what stood out to you as sort of the most significant risk to the energy industry or energy markets of sort of the 5 trends that Mr. Kaplan just walked us through, which were very interesting?
Mm-hmm. I think you need to separate out the time horizons here. I mean, in the short term, I feel like the biggest risks in the system are around the Russia situation still. I mean, Russia is, and what's unique about this disruption is that it is a broad spectrum run. For those of us who've grown up in this space, we're used to thinking about, well, a hurricane impacts production in the Gulf of Mexico or refining, or there's an oil embargo, or there's a cold winter. And here what we're seeing is that Russia is not only the biggest exporter of natural gas in the world, second biggest exporter of oil, a major exporter of coal, and an exporter of important metals, along with Ukraine, a major exporter of grain as well. And so it's a much more generalized commodity shock than we're used to. And there's still room to go. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen with Russian export volumes in the face of a looming EU embargo. There was just an incident on the Nord Stream pipelines yesterday that many of the European countries think was sabotage. The U.S. is attempting to lead an effort to put a price cap on. The Russians have said, fine, we just won't sell it at all. See how you like that. And in with all of that, you have, I think one of the less appreciated dimensions of the crisis that we've been through in the last year is Russia's newfound alliance with the so-called OPEC Plus group, and their ability to keep, those countries from kind of riding to the rescue by increasing production from their spare capacity, to mitigate a tighter market. So I can easily imagine situations where we're not out of the woods yet in the short-term risks to the energy sector, because of the way the Russia-Ukraine situation plays out. Over longer time periods, I think Mr. Kaplan was exactly right that I think this notion of deglobalization combined with the aspiration to pursue a rapid energy transition could very easily lead to more volatility if we don't manage it properly. But therein lies the opportunity as well. And I've just published a paper recently with my colleague Anna Mikulska, who I think is here, on how to make this crisis into an opportunity, by having an honest conversation about the need for a functional energy system, that provides affordable, secure, reliable energy today and at each discrete point in time through the energy transition.
Rich, I'd just like to switch to you kind of with the more boots on the ground focus and what you're seeing in Port of Houston. How are these broader economic trends, interest rates, inflation, recession fears, but a strong desire and support around energy transition, how are things impacting you, boots on the ground standpoint?
So I think it's kind of, I'm going to key on one of Mr. Kaplan's trends as well, which was the technology-enabled disruption, right? As well as his pointing out that the gap isn't going to be filled in the next few years. That gap is going to be filled by technology development across the entire value chain, and I'll focus a little bit on hydrogen. You're going to hear more about it tomorrow. The developments across hydrogen will serve mobility sectors, they will serve residential and industrial, and then there's a big export market. But how does that happen without sort of de-risking the business decisions that have to make it happen? And from a boots on the ground example, one of the prime drivers of early demand of hydrogen is going to be in the mobility sector. It's going to be in trucks. But how do we get truck drivers to buy into a vehicle that costs 2.5 times what a diesel vehicle costs today? We need to be able to either provide the subsidies to accelerate the adoption of that truck. And by the way, I'm not going to buy a hydrogen truck if I don't know if there's a hydrogen fueling station that's going to be ready for me. And the hydrogen producers are going to have to lean in to provide those and kind of match the demand with supply. So again, we can't wait. There are predictions that the price of trucks are going to come down by 2030. But if people aren't buying trucks and increasing the production function of the vehicles themselves, those prices won't come down because it will be imaginary demand. So on the ground, the mobility sector, that's one element. On the ground, the trucking sector, the shipping sector, transitioning to alternative fuels, whether it be methanol or ammonia. These are things that take policies to support the investments, and basically, in a word, it's about de-risking the business decisions associated across the value chain.
And since you brought up hydrogen, and we've all seen the exciting news about Houston becoming a hydrogen hub, could you talk a little bit about what you know of the timeline for that very large project and sort of any specific challenges that you see to that and how that would play out here in Houston.
No, absolutely. And we've been part of a large group working with the Center for Houston's Future, and I don't want to steal Mr. Tudor's comments tomorrow, but they've come up with a forecast of 21 million metric tons of hydrogen production, half of which is going to be an export. But as Mr. Kaplan said, this transition may take 20 years to be realized. There are lots of opportunities. I've mentioned the trucking sector. There's an export market of Houston to the rest of the world. A week ago, we had meetings with the government of Rotterdam to focus on exporting hydrogen from Houston to an import function in Rotterdam. Now, that's going to lead to a question about technology enablement, because I guess the leading suspect for transporting that hydrogen will be via ammonia. And there are still uncertainties in terms of the technology to crack the ammonia back into hydrogen on the other side, issues around transport. There's folks in the audience here that are in the ammonia transport business, and they're very sanguine about the markets. But again, if we're talking about risks across the energy landscape, it's really about de-risking the decisions to either build the plants, build the hydrogen manufacturing, coupling carbon sequestration with hydrogen production so that you can have blue turn to green, and then green hydrogen, the question of nuclear and these other kinds of sources for electricity. And I'll go back to the first presentation as well. There was a chart that talked about the electricity supply over the last 8 years and how it's transitioning in terms of the source of production. But the top of that bar was fairly flat. There's a big question about if we turn on an electricity demand for electric trucks or the electricity to create green hydrogen, where's that electricity supply going to come from, especially in a state like Texas that is having its own challenges in terms of electricity production.
Do you foresee any challenges around, one of the broader risks that I thought would be good to talk about is permitting risks these days. So be good to get your perspective on that relative to the Hydrogen Hub project. And then Helen, I think it'd be great to get your take on that as well for large capital projects for producers.
Yeah, I'll just comment very quickly on permitting. Infrastructure is not an overnight type of activity. It takes investment, and luckily the industry has been investing in infrastructure since the shale revolution drove demand for resins production and LNG exports and things like that. Those plants don't get built overnight, and there a lot of planning and permitting applications can be put in place at great expense. If the permit is withheld, then that's a risk that the investors need to consider, and it's been a challenge. Some projects have been canceled or their permits have been delayed, and I'm not talking about only in Houston, but across the country, across the Texas coast. So that's certainly a real risk for operators who are investing in not just billions but trillions of installed infrastructure.
Right. Helen, your views on that? I mean, and we also just saw the news yesterday that the permitting reform bill that Senator Manchin had proposed looks like it got pulled. So I just wonder if you have thoughts on that from your industry.
Yeah, sure. And I would build on Richard's remarks regarding these pieces of infrastructure don't get built overnight. That is a piece of reality that we are continually working to help our policymakers, both at the state and the federal level, understand that these changes that they often talk about wanting to happen in the energy space take years to bring to fruition, and there are a number of different tentacles that go into influencing those outcomes. But more specific to the permitting aspect of that, we've I would say the oil and gas industry continues to face challenges. Just to be candid, that continues to face challenges and having appropriate turnaround and reliability on permits, even when they're issued, as is well known. There are multiple examples of federal judges coming back later and saying, no, this needs to be redone, that needs to be redone. And that inevitably introduces just a whole other level of risk into those projects and consequently delays them. Since you mentioned Senator Manchin, it's easy to point to the Appalachian Basin and the need for more gas takeaway infrastructure out of that basin. That is not a new issue, but the inability to get either even expansions of pipelines out of Appalachia just continues to in some ways plague the producers that produce there. My company is not active there, but it's well known the capability of the resource in that basin, but you can't get more out without more pipelines.
If we could just switching gears a little bit to renewables, Meghan, there's so much to talk about there. And just front and center in my mind is that clearly, I think in our conversations almost every day, there is huge broad-based support for the energy transition. But then we sort of look around and see what's happening in Europe, and like Mr. Kaplan said, it is scary. It should scare us, and it should be a warning. Maybe they swung the pendulum too far, too fast, and we're seeing them pay the price for that. So in your view, what is a sensible yet aggressive approach to achieve these energy transition goals in a way that it balances things with energy security? And I would also agree with the comment earlier that the timing matters. And so I wonder if you could speak to how fossil fuels and nuclear and renewables can work together to move forward to that, and the pace as well.
That's a lot of questions. I think, so starting with Europe, I think I take away maybe a different perspective from that. Europe is incredibly dependent on Russian gas, now is being cut off from Russian gas and is facing some energy crises. Had Europe transitioned more quickly to a different type of energy that was domestically produced and used, they wouldn't be so worried about the costs of gas and access to gas. Natural gas, this audience knows this, is a global commodity. We've just been talking about this. And the US is one of the largest exporters of natural gas. At the same time, this industry is very dependent on unstable and despotic governments, Russia, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia. Whereas when you think about renewables, they are built locally and that energy is used locally. At this point, for the most part, it is cheaper to build and run a utility scale solar plant than it is to just buy the fuel to run a natural gas plant. So when we talk about security, prices for consumers, we've all seen retail rates go up. Mine have gone up 40% recently. In Puerto Rico, rates have doubled since just 2020, so in the past less than 2 years. And according to the EIA, that's primarily because of natural gas prices driving wholesale rates and then therefore retail rates. Those prices are up about 200% in the past couple of years. So when we think about how do we make sure we have access to the energy that we need and that it comes at a cost that's reasonable for consumers, to me, the answer isn't do more of the same, more of what we've been doing. It is make that transition happen more quickly. We're at a point where renewable energy, I think it's projected to provide about 24% of our energy next year. That's more than coal. So I think at this point, it's probably time to stop calling renewables alternative energy. We are very mainstream at this point. Hopefully that answers some of the questions.
Yes. And just while you're sort of on that subject or somewhat related to it, there was have been some concerns about the equities of renewable, it's expensive to buy a Tesla, or low and moderate income families couldn't necessarily afford that, or potentially to install solar panels on their homes. But you're much closer to that. Is that really true, or do you have a different take on that as well?
Yeah, we think about equity a lot. Obviously, we all should be thinking about equity a lot. It should be front and center in all of the conversations that we're having. One of the top equity issues is communities that are affected by burning fossil fuels and the health outcomes for those communities. No one wants to live next to a fossil fuel plant, but I have neighbors with solar. My house has solar, and none of us have problems with that. So I think the health of those communities should come first and foremost. Second of all, as we think globally about global populations and the impacts of climate change on those populations, Swiss Re, so not a super lefty think tank, but Swiss Re has projected that if we don't meet net zero goals by 2050, global economic growth is projected to go down by 10%. For comparison's sake, at the height of the COVID pandemic, growth went down about 5%, and in 2008, during that recession, it was about 1%. And so all of those countries and all of those people will be very affected by that decrease. Asia is expected to go down about 27%, have a decrease in growth. And so if we aren't meeting the goals that we've set out for ourselves, we stand to lose trillions of dollars. And it's the poor and the low-income families that will be hardest hit by that. Additionally, those people will be hardest hit by famine, by displacement, by rising sea levels. And on top of all of that, they are hardest hit by rising energy costs. So when gas costs a lot and they have to fill up their cars, or when utility rates go up, when they double since 2020, especially in a place where you can't really depend on energy provision in the first place. So I think low-income families will be hardest hit by not moving this as quickly as possible. As far as access to solar and EVs, once again, we can all always do better. At this point, I think the cheapest EV on the market is $25,000, and the government just passed a $7,500 tax credit, which makes, so it's sub 20. You can have access to an EV for sub 20, depending on your income, which is great that it's targeted toward lower income families. As far as solar access, something like 42% of households in California that went solar last year made under $100,000. And I think another 25% made under $150,000. The vast majority of our customers are low and moderate income. We offer financing options for customers, so you don't have to pay cash to put solar panels on your house. You sign up with us and you immediately start saving on your electricity bill. If you have a battery, then you have access to electricity, whether there's a freeze or a hurricane. And so you keep your family safe. You're not subject to a $17,000 bill if there's a surprise freeze. And solar's, it's inflation proof. I mean, you don't pay more for the fuel over time. The fuel costs what it costs. And so I meant to mention on the timing, how do we do this and what should be the mix? I think there's a lot of hubris involved in thinking that any of us can control what that will be, right? Technology will control what it is. Consumer demand will control it. Markets will decide, and of course, government subsidies. At this point, the IMF has said that governments are subsidizing fossil fuels to the tune of, I think, $6 trillion a year, $11 million a minute. So those subsidies definitely sort of distort what the market looks like. But that combination of things will decide how quickly we move. And the thing is, we need to move pretty quickly. If we've already had about a degree of warming so far. At another half a degree, we can expect twice as many plant and animal extinctions, 10 times as much sea ice melting. If all the countries in the world meet the goals they've set out right now, we'll have a warming of 3 degrees, and humans have never lived in a world so hot. So when we think about how quickly this should go, it's going as fast as people are demanding it. And meanwhile, it needs to go as fast as possible. I mean, we're talking about the survival of our species. Someone mentioned Larry Fink earlier, and he said something like, we should focus on sustainability not because we are environmentalists, heaven forbid we be environmentalists, but because we are capitalists and good fiduciaries for our clients. And so I think this transition is happening quickly, needs to happen as quickly as possible, and it makes sense. And it is equitable for it to happen as quickly as possible.
Thank you. Helen, from your perspective, kind of coming more from the fossil fuel side of the industry, what do you think is sort of the right pace or a reasonable timeline to achieve these objectives and the opportunities to work together with renewables in that process?
Sure. So let me start by stating that when we look at the global energy mix, we absolutely see renewable, both solar and wind, increasing at a more rapid pace in the coming years. But in addition to that, among a range of scenarios that we examine, both internally created and looking at every externally generated scenario, whether it's EIA or IEA and a host of others, we do observe that there is a high likelihood, nothing is certain, but there is a high likelihood that oil and natural gas and other fossil fuels will continue to be needed in order to sustain global economic growth as well as meet energy demand. I think it's also important to point out in this, maybe is starting to kind of move towards the conversation about equity, is if you have this conversation in other parts of the world, it takes on a very different tone in terms of pace. I've sat in rooms where people from emerging markets, particularly those in several in Asia and Africa, will tell you very, very candidly, we don't view it as equitable to tell us to decarbonize before we've even carbonized. So I think that's a very powerful way to just step back and recognize that we in the United States and Europe can have and do have one perspective on this, but there is a large part of the world, which by the way has most of the population of the world, that is coming at this from a different starting point. So I bring all this in to come back to the question of pace. And so we think of it as, well, one, I don't have a particular answer for what is the right pace. It's not anyone's place to say. But I think what we all need to try to come together on is that we very likely have a wide array of agreement on the destination, net zero. But by when? And what does that look like? So it's more about how quickly do we get there and what pathway do we take to get there. But we're all working to get there. In the interim, companies like mine are focused on producing the oil and gas that the world is demanding, and doing so in a sustainable, low GHG intensity fashion, and delivering those products and being reliable.
In that sense, is it possible to view the Russian invasion and Europe's move away from Russian gas as creating more of an opportunity for U.S. producers and, to Megan's point, to get moving more quickly on this?
Well, I think you're seeing that it has created an opportunity or a market opening particularly for LNG exports. Of course, the U.S. has been exporting coal as well, and Europe will burn more coal this year than probably they've ever burned before, as a necessity. So there are opportunities that have come about out of this. I think what's still hard or difficult to discern is how hard and fast are the Europeans going to hold to moving in one direction versus another. Put differently, we hear the same things you and others hear of some European leaders saying this means we need to move faster away from fossil fuels, while concurrently others are saying, well, actually, no, maybe we need to step back and reassess, particularly with respect to nuclear. And I know the topic of nuclear power was brought up earlier. But so there's still a lot of uncertainty there as to how this is going to play out.
Mm-hmm.
Mark, follow up on that?
Yes, thank you. I think the situation in Europe, and to a lesser degree, we're all living through it, as a result of the turmoil in global energy markets, is kind of a reminder that governing is hard. There's a lot of different objectives that society and voters have. It's a sustainable, energy system, and national security, or jobs, or equity. Where do these prerogatives line up and pull in the same direction, and where do they potentially conflict, and how do you manage those choices? I think the irony is that coming out of where we've been in the last year or two, we're likely to see, relative to where we were before, a faster transition and more investment in oil and gas. And actually, I think that that's okay. If you look at, for example, the IEA's net zero scenario, they show worldwide oil demand falling to about 25 million barrels a day by 2050, and yet still requires new investment in oil production and natural gas production, because of the decline rate of the current base. And so the idea that actually you need to invest more in oil and gas, even as you invest more aggressively in the transition, is, I think, something that we're being forced to recognize, by the reality of the pinch that we're in at the moment. And I think it could be channeled in a constructive way if we're willing to have that honest conversation.
And just thinking, for example, one area where you would need both is, EVs come to mind. If I'm going to plug an EV into a battery at home, I need, power plant somewhere providing the electricity to charge that vehicle. Do you, I guess, relative to the surge in EVs and other things going on in the energy market, see gas overtaking oil? And it was, I think, mentioned in a prior presentation about oil peaking in, the next few years.
People have been calling for oil to peak for a long time. Meghan would know more about this than I would, but I think the concept is you have the electric car and you have the electric generation being provided by renewable sources. Renewables are 24% of U.S. power generation today, but natural gas and coal are still 50%. And that's, in a country that is, way ahead of the world average. Globally, globally, nuclear energy provides 4% of the world's total energy mix. Hydroelectricity is about 7%. Other renewables, largely wind and solar, are about 7%. And whatever the math is, the other 82% is fossil energy today. And so the question is, we kind of need all of this to have a functional energy system at the moment, and we have to make sure we invest in maintaining that functionality as we progress. Will natural gas surpass oil? I fall back on one of Joe's comments earlier about the need to be humble. The range of possible outcomes, even in a successful net zero scenario, varies dramatically depending on what the modeler's assumptions are. What wins? What's the technology that wins? Is it energy efficiency? Is it renewables with batteries? Is it nuclear? Is it carbon capture and sequestration? I have no idea what the answer to that is. What I have confidence in is that people are pretty creative, about finding solutions when they're given the right incentive. I think that's the one truly inexhaustible resource we have is human ingenuity. And so the trick is, how do we line up a system that provides the right incentives, to have a rapid transition to a more sustainable energy future while still maintaining a functional energy system at each point in a way that kind of frees up the creativity to find the unexpected answers, that none of us anticipates today.
Sounds like some of what you're saying is that we need not just the private sector to drive the innovation forward, but we do also need government policies behind that are sort of laying the foundation for that. Rich, are you seeing that play out successfully at Port Houston as it's moving to become cleaner, more sustainable?
Yeah, I think that, as I said before, these transitions aren't going to happen without a stimulus, whether that's a policy that supports zero-emission vehicles or whatever. the policy angle is going to be very important. But it's also, we need to be realistic. Even inside the United States, we've got different policy drivers in different states. Texas is much more a free market, and it's about whether all the opportunities that Mark just mentioned have a profitability and an economic value proposition. They're going to work faster here as opposed to a state that regulates and mandates the use of hydrogen or the use of, in the ports, shore power, these types of things. All of those technologies can happen here, but they have to have more of a profit motive and a clear value proposition. And so I think that there's a prime the pump role for the Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, but that is billions of dollars when I heard somebody say 150 trillion is going to be required. So the real money is going to have to come from investors in real businesses that make sense. Here in Houston, just a mile from here and sponsored by this university is the ION, and across the street is Greentown Labs. There's a lot of innovation happening here, and that has to be leaned into. I see a lot of private money investing in those startups, and I think there's a balance between the public policy and the private. The other risk also, I think there's two. One of them is policies can change. Right? There are still detractors from the current incentives that are in the bills that just passed. Those may be reversed depending on the political winds of this country. And the other risk is, I guess let's call it collaboration, and that word is overused, but there's a well-known 11-company consortium seeking to do a $100 billion carbon sequestration project. That's 11 companies with 11 teams of accountants and lawyers and engineers that have to get together, and no policy is going to accelerate that conversation faster than the CEOs themselves saying we need to make these kinds of things happen.
Thank you. Coming back to Mark, some of the kind of interesting things that are going on right now and seem to be impacting the energy markets quite a bit are what's going on with OPEC. They have not been injecting more supply, even as demand in Europe is at an all-time high. That's internationally, and then also what's happening with the SPR here in the U.S. And I just wondered if you could touch on both of those things and the risk or opportunities that's posing for energy.
I think some of the kind of old pillars that we've all relied on in the oil market are changing under our feet. And these are all the points you raised, Meghan, are demonstrations of it. When Iraq invaded Kuwait, Saudi Arabia said, "How much can I increase production? How quickly?" And when Russia invaded Ukraine, Saudi Arabia within the OPEC Plus group said, we're nothing for us to see here. We're just going to kind of stick with our plan of kind of very cautious, measured restoration of production cuts that we had put in place during COVID, and that's what we think is the right thing to do. Even after the president and other consuming country leaders asked for accelerated production. So I think that there something has changed. And whether it's the bilateral relationship the United States has with these countries, whether it's their relationship with Russia, what combination of those, new leaders, all of these things I think are coloring this kind of changed level of engagement. And then on top of that, you have the coordinated release of U.S. and strategic stocks from other members of the International Energy Agency as well. The U.S. has released oil from its strategic stockpile at a pace that is without precedent over the 50-year history of the SPR. Just in the last year, the U.S. has sold about 200 million barrels out of the SPR. That's equivalent to adding 750,000 barrels a day of new supply on top of what's been going on in the marketplace. How will that be managed going forward, and what are the rules of engagement? We'll have to kind of see how these things shift. And by the way, That's all we've talked about is oil. And the reason for that is because the world's energy security framework has been built up over 50 years around oil. As much as we criticize that system, it doesn't exist for any other form of energy or for the bare base minerals that are needed for the energy transition. So there's no strategic stockpile. There's no treaties that obligate countries to coordinate. There's no countries dedicated to maintaining buffers of spare production capacity. And so I think the idea that we need to kind of broaden our energy security framework to include other forms of energy and the critical minerals that are needed in the energy transition, is a really important thought. The good news is I think the U.S. government and others around the world are moving in that direction, but it's very early days still.
Okay. We're getting close to the end of our panel time. We're not quite there yet, but if there are questions from the audience, start sending up the cards and I can look through those. Meghan, on that last remark about key minerals needed for the energy transition in your industry and solar, can you talk about some of the kind of primary risks to your supply chain and your business?
Yeah, well, for the most part, for solar panels, they're pretty abundant earth minerals. We need aluminum, glass, silicon. It's all some copper. For the most part, that's pretty abundant. On the battery side, because we include that now, since dispatchable solar is obviously more valuable, a lot of manufacturers have started changing from lithium-ion batteries to lithium phosphate because phosphate's easier to get. So supply chains are shifting, and a lot of what sort of goes into to a lot of the panels and the batteries and the balance of systems that are needed are fairly abundant. Like with anything, there's it is an extraction industry, and so there are always challenges associated with that, especially when some of those extraction locations are challenging. For example, we get a lot of polysilicon from China. The world does. The world gets 95% of its polysilicon from China. That goes into solar panels as well as a lot of the technology that we all use on a day-to-day basis. And so shifting, being cognizant of what those supply chains are and making sure we shift them and are thoughtful about the countries that we partner with, as we're all aware on the oil and gas side, that can get tricky. So making sure that, that our partners are strong partnerships, and that we do as much domestic production as possible. And that was one of the most valuable parts, I think, of the Inflation Reduction Act. There's a section in it that supports domestic manufacturing along the supply chain. So polysilicon, ingots, wafer cells, modules, and then balance of system inputs as well in batteries. So we're working on building up a domestic supply chain, which I think, once again, will just contribute to energy security when we can buy those components and materials and then final products locally here.
When we think about wind and solar becoming a bigger part of the portfolio of how we consume energy, it is true that it's intermittent. Sun doesn't shine at night, wind doesn't always blow. How do you manage through that and address that risk or concern in the energy market? Yeah,
definitely. You cannot always count on any type of energy source, right? And during the Texas freeze, I think 87% of the outages were the result of natural gas failures. So you can't always depend on that. The Vogtle nuclear plant in Georgia is 6 years over time and $16 billion over budget. So you can't always count on that. So every type of energy source sort of has its intermittency problems. Solar and wind are definitely no exception to that rule. A lot of you are probably aware of this, but 20 to 25% of our energy system is overbuilt to serve 3% of need. Just that 3% of when energy is at its peak. One way to think about shaving that, and then not having to overbuild the system by so much and invest so much in that, is on the demand management side or demand side management. You can do that with smart thermostats. You can do that with solar and storage. You can do that with some energy efficiency. One very inelegant example of it happened just a couple of weeks ago in California when they were faced with some rolling blackouts, with some outages. And the head of CAISO texted everyone in California and said, we're about to shut off your power. If everyone could just reduce your usage, that would be great. And people responded to that text message and reduced their usage 2,000 megawatts in just a couple of minutes. And then California didn't have any blackouts. That's a demand-side management solution, obviously not very coordinated, organized, or elegant. So there are better ways to do that. But if you think about how you sort of integrate people into the process, make it a more transactional energy system. Sort of up until now, we've had, or even very much now, we have this command and control system. And a lot of grid operators think of demand as this exogenous variable they must meet with supply. But rather than matching supply to whatever the demand is, what if you match the demand to whatever the supply is? So if the supply is somewhat variable, as it can be with solar and wind, with utility scale solar and wind, you manage that with home energy management systems and functions. And so you lower demand at the home. You say your air conditioning turns on, that maybe you have a mechanism that shuts off your electric vehicle charging. So you charge at night, maybe when wind is really abundant. And so making our system more dynamic, transactional, less command and control, and less top down will allow us to then integrate the cheapest form of energy at this point that has no fuel costs and that is variable, and also to manage the other variabilities of other types of energy sources.
Rich, follow-up comments on that?
I'd just like to add, we're in Houston, the global energy capital of the world. There are 500 million barrels of liquid storage along the ship channel. That midstream sector is really big. And those companies don't only think about what they're moving today, they're storage companies. And I've had several conversations with companies that are thinking about the future of energy storage, and whether that be giant battery banks or new innovative technologies to store that energy to increase the resiliency of the grid. That's an important part of this whole conversation and the whole energy system as it's going to develop here.
One last question. Who would be our kind of key allies or key energy trading partners as we look, I guess, in U.S. production, or who we're dealing with outside? Who are the key relationships that we should be fostering or improving in that regard to facilitate our stability here? Rich or Helen, either. I'm sorry, Helen or Mark. I'm looking.
Well, I guess I would say our best ally is a functioning marketplace. When Winston Churchill was considering whether to switch the British Navy from domestic coal to foreign oil, this question of energy security came up, and his answer was, security lies in diversity and diversity alone. So having a flexible global marketplace actually provides a lot of this that's kind of the first line of defense, I guess I would say. But that's this system of globalization, if we believe that it has benefits, then it needs kind of an active cultivation and defense. And we need to kind of make the case for it and demonstrate the value of it to ourselves and to the other participants in it. And so that's, I think, part of the challenge / opportunity that we face is trying to, if we believe that this system has served our interest reasonably well, for in the post-war era, then we need to make the case for it to continue.
There have been more questions from the audience, but I'll wrap it up there and just encourage anybody that didn't get their question asked because of time to visit with any of our panelists. But thank you all very much. Enjoyed the discussion.
Thank you.